During the 1981 NFL playoffs, the San Diego Chargers went to Miami to meet the Miami Dolphins in the divisional round, a matchup that favored the Dolphins on paper. But thankfully, football is not played on paper, and these two teams would have one of the most chaotic matchups in NFL history, a record-setting game that to this day holds up as one of the craziest football games ever. We start with the Miami Dolphins, who finished 11-4-1, winning their division for the 5th year in a row. The Fins are led by head coach Don Shula, who's in his 12th season as head coach of the Dolphins. Shula is universally seen as one of the greatest football coaches ever, having led the Fins to back-to-back Super Bowl victories in 72 and 73. The 72 team was the first and only team to this day to go undefeated in the regular season and win the Super Bowl. But defense was the Fins' calling card, finishing with a top 5 defensive unit, with 7 of their wins coming from games where their defense held the opponent to 10 points or less. However, they did not create many turnovers, finishing in the bottom 5 in takeaways. The Dolphins, though, were masters in not taking penalties. Playing a clean game, they committed very few penalties, the least amount of penalties in the last 6 years. Meanwhile, the offense was mediocre at best, finishing 11th in the NFL in scoring. They were led by quarterbacks David Woodley and Don Strock. Woodley started all but one of the games, getting most of the work throughout the season, but he was mediocre at best, and Strock would come in multiple times throughout the season as he was the much better passer of the two, while Woodley, meanwhile, excelled more with his legs as the Fins preferred to rely on the running game, which was led by Andre Franklin and Tony Nathan. Meanwhile, the San Diego Chargers were the exact opposite in almost every way. Going 10-6 in the regular season, they won the AFC West for the 3rd season in a row, led by head coach Don Coryell and his revolutionary Air Coryell offense, being one of the first NFL teams to have success with a passing-focused attack. And leading his offense was Hall of Fame quarterback Dan Fouts, who thanks to Coryell's offense broke numerous passing records, including in this very season where he broke his own record for passing yards, and somehow he got massively disrespected come MVP time, where he finished just 6th in MVP voting. And Fouts had an abundance of weapons at his disposal, with 1,000-yard rusher Chuck Muncie in the backfield and wide receivers Charlie Joyner and mid-season acquisition Wes Chandler. But his most dangerous weapon was fellow Hall of Famer tight end Kellen Winslow, one of the most impactful players in NFL history. He revolutionized the tight end position into what we see today, as tight ends are used not just as blockers in the run game, but sometimes as the main offensive threat on their team. However, their defense was suspect, finishing 26th out of the 28 teams, allowing 24 points per game. But the silver lining for them was their ability to create turnovers, as they finished in the top 10 in takeaways. So we head out to the Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida. Fun fact, the Orange Bowl took place the night before on the same field with the Clemson Tigers, beating the Nebraska Cornhuskers 22-15, finishing off an undefeated season and a national championship for the Tigers. The Chargers would get the ball first, and they would move right down the field thanks to a 54-yard pass from Fouts to Wes Chandler. But the Fins' defense would hold them to a field goal as the Chargers would take a 3-0 lead early. The San Diego defense would come out and quickly force a punt as Woodley would start for the Fins but fail to get anything going, and the Fins special teams unit would show their appreciation by giving up a 56-yard punt return touchdown to Wes Chandler. And just when you think it can't get any worse for the Dolphins, on the ensuing kickoff, the Fins special teams would avoid the ball like the plague, and the Chargers would jump on it to give them the ball back deep inside of Dolphins territory. The Dolphins special teams unit has showed up large early, but not in a good way. The Chargers would then try some trickery with a halfback pass, but the Dolphins defense would snuff it out, and Fouts would instead find old reliable Kellen Winslow to take them down to the 1-yard line. And 2 plays later, it's Chuck Muncie taking it in to make it 17-0 San Diego. The Dolphins' offense would touch the ball for just the second time all night, and their offense would get in on the fun with a pass going right off the wide receiver's hands, and Glenn Edwards, the Chargers safety, would pick it off, taking it all the way down inside the Dolphins' 10. Fouts would find James Brooks, the rookie out of Auburn, on a swing pass, and he would take it in to make it 24-0 Chargers. Both teams would punt on their next possession, and with Miami in a deep hole, they would turn to respected backup Don Strock. Strock would lead the Fins down into Charger territory for the first time all night, spreading the ball around to different receivers, but on 3rd and long, he throws an ill-advised pass that gets dropped by a Charger defender in the end zone, and the Fins would be forced to settle for a field goal, which they would convert to make it 24-3 Chargers. The Dolphins defense would then step up with a massive play. After being hung out to dry early, they would force a sack fumble that they would recover to set their offense up in Charger territory. And Strock would lead the Fins right down the shortened field with quick, sharp passes, eventually finding Joe Rose for a touchdown to make it 24-10. Fouts would take the Chargers down into Dolphins territory, but they would miss a 55-yard field goal, and the Dolphins would get the ball back with under a minute left in the half. And with time running out, the Fins would get creative, calling a hook and lateral with 6 seconds left that works to perfection as they score with no time left on the clock and somehow cut the San Diego lead to 7 at the half. And coming out of the half, Shula would keep the pressure on the Chargers as Strock would lead the Dolphins down the field, slinging the rock all over the place, eventually finding Joe Rose to tie the game at 24. Both teams would punt on their next possession, and with the Chargers offense now going into a slump, Fouts would have to respond, and he did, leading a drive where he would eventually find Kellen Winslow wide open down the seam, and the Chargers would retake the lead 31-24. But Don Strock would continue his magical night, finding Bruce Hardy with a pinpoint strike to tie the game at 31. And Fouts would get his chance to respond, but he would have a wild overthrow that gets picked off by Glenn Blackwood. And just before Blackwood is tackled, he pitches the ball back to teammate Gerald Small, who proceeds to take it an extra 20 yards, setting the Fins up deep in San Diego territory. And Tony Nathan would take it in just moments later to put the Fins on top for the first time tonight after trailing 24-0 at the end of the first. The Chargers offense, meanwhile, would continue to struggle as they would be forced to punt on their next possession. And with time running down, the Dolphins would turn to their running game, which had been non-existent for most of the night, and they would chew clock, taking the ball into Charger territory before fumbling and giving the ball back to the Chargers' high-powered offense with 4 minutes left on the clock. With the Chargers in desperate need of a score, they would turn to the air, and Fouts would use all 3 of his favorite weapons, Joyner, Chandler, and Winslow, who would get hurt on the first play of the drive, but be able to come back in, and finally, Fouts would find James Brooks in the back of the end zone to tie the game at 38. But there was still a minute left, and after a Charger penalty on the kickoff and a decent Dolphins return, they finally had a chance to finish off their epic comeback. Don Strock would lead the Dolphins offense out onto the field, and he would move them down into field goal range quickly. The Fins now had their chance to end the madness once and for all. Enter Uwe von Schaman, who's 1 for 1 so far tonight and 24 of 31 on the year. The game now rests on his shoulders, and his kick would be blocked by Chargers tight end Kellen Winslow, who flat out refuses to see his team lose this game, as he has already set the record for catches in a playoff game tonight, and he comes off the bench injured to block a kick and keep the Chargers season alive. So we head to overtime, tied at 38, The Chargers would get the ball first, and on a big third down, Fouts would find Winslow, who's injured and heads off to the bench in serious pain, only to come back moments later and catch another third down pass to keep their drive alive before heading back to the sidelines in more pain. There was no way he was going to see his team lose on this night. It wasn't possible. But that last big catch by Winslow put them in field goal range, and after a tough run from Brooks, they would send Rolf Benirske out for a game-winning field goal, but he would miss the chip shot as the madness would continue, and the Dolphins now had another chance to end the game. The Finns would be forced to punt quickly on their next possession, and the Chargers would get the ball back with a chance to end the game yet again. But they would fumble, and the Finns would recover to set them up in San Diego territory. Backup quarterback Don Strock would lead the Dolphins back into field goal range, but Uwe von Schamann would miss another field goal as the Dolphins special teams would continue to implode. So the Chargers get the ball back, and Fouts would find Chandler to put them at midfield, and moments later, it's Charlie Joyner coming up with a big catch to set them up in the Dolphins' red zone. And Chargers head coach Don Coryell would say that's enough, as he would call on his field goal unit for what he hopes is the final time. And finally, after 12 minutes of overtime, Rolf Benirske puts it through the uprights, sending the Chargers on to the AFC Championship game with a 41-38 victory. One of the greatest football games to ever be played, with classic moments and insane performances littered throughout. A game that would go on to be coined the Epic in Miami. The Chargers would go on to lose to Cincinnati the following week, in a game that would see freezing cold temperatures as low as -9, with a wind chill of -59. They would make the playoffs the following year, but lose in the divisional round to none other than the Miami Dolphins, who would get their revenge on the Chargers. And the Chargers would fail to make the playoffs again until 1992, after Coryell, Fouts, and Winslow were all gone. Meanwhile, the Dolphins would go on to make the Super Bowl the following year after beating the Chargers in the divisional round. But they would lose to the Washington Redskins, led by head coach Joe Gibbs, and 2 years later, with rookie Dan Marino at quarterback, they would make it back to the Super Bowl, but run in to Joe Montana and the 49ers, who would blow them out, and the Dolphins have yet to make it back to the Super Bowl since.